The scripture that we read this morning introduced us to a character named Hannah. Hannah's story overlaps with the end of the book of Judges, but it also kicks off the book of 1 Samuel. And 1 Samuel is a book that narrates sweeping change in the world of God's chosen people. And so this morning we're going to hear from Hannah in her own words, as if she were here telling her story to you. And so together let us remember Hannah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hannah. And in order for you to understand my story, I feel as though I need to set the stage. My world was a world of change. History was happening, and we could feel it all around us. We could see it in our world. Maybe you know what I am talking about. In my time, too much of the world around us was not encouraging or hope-giving. My people, the Hebrew people, had long known that we were God's chosen people. We knew this because God called our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, and God promised to make them into a great nation and to give them a land of their own. And that promise was a long time in coming true. And that promise took us into the shadow of slavery in Egypt. But then God heard our desperate cries and took us out of the land of slavery through a wall of water. And then as we wandered in the desert, God was with us. Through all the years that we wandered before we crossed the threshold of the land of promise, God was leading us through a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. God led us through Moses and through Miriam and through Aaron and through Joshua into the land of the now increasingly ancient promise. And now that we were a nation, now that we had a land of our own, now that we could finally rest from the travel and the trouble that defined us for so long, it seemed that the second that we didn't have to depend on God for food every morning and to guide our steps every day, in other words, the moment that life got really good, that, it seems, was the moment that we liked to forget about God. And since then, it seemed that things had kind of been moving in a downward spiral. My people had no united political leadership, and our religious leaders were not much better. The priest that we knew, Eli, he was all right, I suppose, but his sons were scoundrels, the worst kind of people. They preyed on others, and they treated the offerings that people brought in good faith to represent their devotion to the Lord. They treated those offerings with contempt. And those were supposed to be the people who would lead us when Eli was gone. But what's worse is it wasn't just the leaders of our people. Everyone did as they saw fit, no matter how cruel or self-serving or how much it hurt anyone else. Now, of course, there were good people in a world. Even in a world that's difficult, there's always something good. But some of us wondered in our hearts, even if we didn't dare speak the words aloud for fear of validating them, if perhaps our people would not survive this generation. We wondered where in the world we could see God with all of this human bad behavior when people were mostly about getting what they could for themselves or only looking out for their own. History was happening, but I despaired what would become of us on the other side of that history. And I had questions, such as where was God when we were struggling? Had God gone ahead and just left us to our own devices after all? And every time I picked up a newspaper and read the headlines, sometimes I thought I wouldn't blame God if God had done so. In light of what was going on in the world and what was going on with my people, I often felt confused and helpless as to what I could do to act as one of God's own people in a world such as mine. And so as my story begins, I carried this burden for the world around me. I wondered what was going to happen. I wondered how to live faithfully in the frightening world. And at the same time, in addition to all these public cares, like many of you, I carried my own private burdens. I had a personal ache. It was almost a shame, because in all the years I'd been married to my husband, Elkanah, I was not able to have a child. And this shame and this ache was compounded by a woman that I had come to see not just as a rival, but actually as an enemy. I know we're not supposed to have them, but I did. My husband's second wife, Penina. Penina was everything I was not, and she got to live out her dream right before my eyes. She didn't have just one child. No, she had an entire brood of children, and boy, did she like to rub that in my face. Every meal that we shared was an exercise in just how much I could bear being around her. All her backhanded jabs and those, innocent comments, they all wounded like 1,000 tiny paper cuts. My home was filled with Penina and with her children, and month after month and year after year, I had no children at all. And I vacillated between a struggle. I always felt small and insignificant and forgotten. But sometimes I wished that I actually was invisible so that Penina and her children would just leave me alone. And the only way that I made it through some of those days was because Elkanah, my husband, was a sun in my otherwise cloudy sky. And Elkanah thought that should be enough for me, but it simply was not. He was kind, to be certain, but he didn't share my pain. Sometimes it even seemed that he couldn't see it. After all, he did have children of his own through Penina. And so I often felt like I was the only one in my household whom God overlooked with blessing. I felt the disappointment and the grief that I carried. It was like a burden. And my thoughts consumed me by night as I lined up my hurts one by one. I yearned for a child of my own to hold in my arms. And I was in pain from the repeated stings of seeing someone else get everything I prayed for. Penina's words would ring in my ears, and even my husband's kindness wasn't remotely enough. He couldn't fix this. And so if I felt little hope for the world around me, I had even less for my own life. I was brokenhearted, and I despaired that anything would ever change. And it was from this place of deep dissatisfaction with the world, as my personal pain was beginning to harden into bitterness, and as I worried for the future, and as I nursed this unstoppable ache, that I snuck into the temple one night. Now, we were on a trip. Our family made this trip every year to worship God. We would have a feast of celebration in honor of God. And this was supposed to be a joyous time. All the best foods to eat and lots to drink. Maybe you can picture your own Thanksgiving celebrations when you think of that meal. And maybe you remember how when family and friends draw close together around a meal such as that one, it can be at the same time an experience you look forward to all year long, as well as one of the most difficult times. I was struggling. And all the armor I usually muster against my rivals' hurtful words and slights had failed me. In the midst of this happy gathering, with so much going on around us, no one even noticed how I sat there. My food was untouched on my plate. I couldn't even eat one bite. Finally, I managed to slip away, and I sought an encounter in the holy place. I wanted to find God, and I hoped it would at least soothe my pain. And as soon as I entered the gate of God's temple, the bitter tears began to flow in a hot torrent. And they brought with them all the misery and the trouble and the pain and the sorrow that I had pushed down so deep inside me so that I could get through those long days and even longer nights. And in that sacred place, I wept and I wept, silently rehearsing my misery and bitterness and even my disappointment before God. And I wasn't sure that God could even see me. I didn't know if God remembered the name Hannah, since favor and grace, which is the meaning of my name, seemed to pass over me every time good news came to our household. And in that moment, I asked God to remember me and to give me a gift. And I felt that I was empty-handed, that I had nothing to give back to God other than my furious spirit and my bitter tears. And so as I prayed, I even promised that if God would give me what I asked for, that I would return the gift that God gave to God for God's service. And if that sounds a bit like a bargain to you, like the kind of prayer you pray when you are so desperate you have nowhere else to turn, well, it was. But that's all I had in me that day: my lament, my complaint, my bitter tears. And that night as I was praying, someone actually did notice me. It was the old priest, Eli. At first, he mistook my passionate and painful prayers for having indulged too much at the feast that night, which is pretty ironic since I hadn't been able to bring myself to consume even the littlest bit of food, let alone imbibe enough to become drunk. Embarrassed that he had seen me weeping, and even more so that he thought I was actually intoxicated, I scrambled to reassure him that I was not drunk. I just needed a place to pour out my grief and my anguish to God. And Eli remarkably heard my words, and he saw my heart, and he blessed me. He even added his own best wishes that I would get an answer to my troubled prayer. And when I left the temple of the Lord that night, although nothing had really changed, I felt lighter somehow. Pouring out my heart and my grief before the altar of the Lord made a difference. I'd appeared before God as vulnerable as I was. I gave voice to all those things I had bottled up inside me. I brought all of it, just as I was, my ragged heart, and I wasn't lovely, and I wasn't put together or confident or wrapped in an acceptable package. I gave to God all the hurt and all the ache and every unanswered prayer. I let God have every piece of it. I did not hold back in the presence of the Lord, and I left that place feeling different than when I had come in, even though that might sound strange to say. Now, I didn't know any of this on the moonlit night when I walked out of the temple shrine with a straighter back and a lighter spirit than I had in a very long time, but my instincts were right. History was happening all around my little life, and I would not see this for the momentous moment that it actually was until quite some time in the future. But as it turns out, sometimes the greatest earthquakes have their epicenters in the most unexpected places. Somehow, some way, God had not forgotten me, and God had plans underway. God heard my anguished prayer and answered in a way that was even better than I had imagined, even in my favorite and most hope-filled daydreams. And before that year turned to the next one, I discovered to my startled joy that I had conceived a child. And then he was here, in the world, the son that I had hoped for and longed for and ached for. And when he was born, I was faced with a choice. I had asked God not to forget me, and God showed me through my son that I was not forgotten. But now that I held in my arms the answer to my prayer, this concrete proof that God was listening, and even more that God was working things out, I had to decide what to do next. I had asked God for something in the sanctuary that night, and I'd made a bargain of my own. Would I be bound by those words that I had spoken out of desperation? I know what it's like to feel like my hands were empty. God knows how empty my hands were, and my room was, and my heart was, and how empty I felt, those long years. And I've also known what it's like to have my hands full of diaper changes and nighttime feedings and trying to make garments for this boy that keeps growing and growing and trying to find time to cook and to clean. And I know what it's like to feel so full of love for him. Because I know what it all feels like, I delayed as long as I could. I kept Samuel with me. I fought within my spirit to justify holding on to him just a little bit longer, just a little bit more. Because the truth was, I was scared to give up this little miracle who had taken away the shame that I felt each and every day. But I also learned that God blesses, but blessed people cannot keep their hands clenched. There is value in letting go. And they say that courage is not the absence of fear, but instead courage is being afraid but doing it anyway. And so I opened my hands and I let go. And when he was about 3 years old, I took my son back to that priest who had blessed me that fateful night so that my little Samuel might be dedicated to the service of the Lord. And did Samuel ever serve God? I watched him grow, mostly from afar, but I lived for that 1 week of every year when I would go back to that shrine where I dropped him off, that place where I prayed for him to come into my life, and I would give him a gift of clothing that I had labored over all year long. And from tiny, insignificant, and shame-bound Hannah came a man who would be so consequential that he would change the world around us within just a span of a couple of generations. My little Samuel, as it turns out, was so attuned to the heart of God that he became like those judges of old, the kind of leaders that were legends in our community, that we would tell their stories around the fire at night, and we would pass those stories on to our children in their cradles as they drifted off to sleep. And I know that I'm his mother, and I'm probably biased, but I think that the history speaks for itself. The baby that I begged God for was one of the most influential spiritual and political leaders that our people had ever seen. And on this side of the new heavens and the new earth, I didn't see all the ways that Samuel would shape the world and the outsized influence that he had on it. I was allowed only to witness a foretaste of what God was up to. But I don't think I ever could have dreamed the kind of future that Samuel lived to see and the way he shaped the difficult and bleak days in which I lived my life. There was much to repair and to reform in my world. My people needed a fresh start. I needed a fresh start. Then God showed up with this gift of little Samuel, as God is always doing something new. And from this backdrop of deepest shadow and gloom and ever-deepening rock bottoms, from the personal anguish that nearly turned into cynicism, God opened a future that was certainly more than I could ever imagine. And it seems to me, as I think about the stories of my people, that God often chooses people like Abraham, who had no land, people like Sarah, who had no children, Moses from the despised and enslaved people under a death sentence, the ladies of ill repute, Rahabs, and the refugee Ruths, and the youthful Marys, and the tempestuous Peters, and the murderers Pauls, and even the discounted Hannahs, to work through to do new and exciting things. And so if there's one thing I can tell you from my experiences with God, it is that there is no gloom so deep that God does not see you. No sadness or ache too hard for God to hold you, and no future too big for God to create. God is always at work in new and different ways to repair and redeem the world, and sometimes we have to open our hands. I would love to close our time together with a prayer, so would you bow with me in a word of prayer? Dear God, sometimes we struggle with the world around us. We know that we're supposed to be thankful, and we are. But sometimes it is hard to find the joy that we know that we need, and that you, God, know that we need, when our needs and our anxieties weigh so heavily upon us. And so we come before you this morning just as we are, with our loneliness and our loss and our scarcity and our sorrow. God, sometimes it feels like there is just not enough to go on, even though we aren't supposed to say that when we're supposed to be saying thank you. It can feel like there's not enough money to pay the bills, or not enough jobs or safety for those who do have them. It feels sometimes like there's not enough wisdom for the solution to our problems, not enough strength or comfort or connection. And so we come before you, God, and ask that you would meet us here in this place, whatever place we find ourselves today. We hear your promise to us, "Come to me, all who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." And so we come before you and we find rest for our souls, finding gladness in even the tiny, tiny graces. Amen. Beloved, you are made in God's image. So go from this time of honest worship to live an honest life, to listen and to love, trusting in the God who hears us, in the Christ who knows us, and the Spirit who breathes love into us. Amen. Go in peace.